Today, we're diving into a topic we get, a ton of questions
I
about.
know, right?
Yeah. We're going to be focusing on low dose IVF. Now, it's worth mentioning that low dose IVF has many synonyms and many different names, and we're going to go through that as well. So many patients out there have lower egg reserve or are looking for something different. And this is where this discussion comes up a lot. So we thought it'd be really helpful to break it down, talk about it, and go through some of the actual evidence.
Absolutely. Now, before we get into the details of low dose IVF or mini IVF, let's give our listeners a quick primer on traditional IVF protocols because you need to understand what a standard or traditional IVF protocol is to understand how a low dose IVF differs.
Hmm, awesome idea. So, in traditional IVF, we are typically aiming to get around 10 to 15 eggs at the time of retrieval. Now, obviously, this will depend on egg reserve, but that's our general aim. And the reason for this is that because we know not every egg is going to be a good egg, not every egg will fertilize, not every fertilized egg will become an embryo. And therefore, we want that higher number of eggs to start with so that as, the numbers kind of funnel down, we get good embryos. Now, to do this, we use medications that are called gonadotropins. And there's many different types, but basically they stimulate the ovaries to get them to grow a bunch of eggs at a time.
Exactly. And the dose of gonadotropins that we use really depends on each patient's ovarian reserve. And we determine ovarian reserve based on tests such as AMH level or anti-Mullerian hormone level and follicle count. So someone with high ovarian reserve might need a lower dose of the gonadotropins to get those 10 to 15 eggs, while someone with lower ovarian reserve may need a higher dose of the gonadotropins to get those ideal 10 to 15x.
And this is where things get a little bit complicated because sometimes when a patient has low ovarian reserve, even the maximum doses of gonadotropins may still only give us, one, two, three, four eggs even. Really, it's a function of we can only get what your ovary will give us.
That's right. And this is exactly where low dose IVF comes in. So instead of using those high dose of gonadotropins, which by the way also equals high costs, then we could use a lower dose of gonadotropin, like let's say 150 to 200 units versus 450 units, in order to get those 2 to 3 eggs that are available in the ovary.
Now, I can already hear our listeners asking, why would we use a lower dose if we're already getting fewer eggs? I literally just talked about trying to get more eggs to have higher success. It's super counterintuitive, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a great question. And now here is the tricky part. Sometimes with lower doses of gonadotropin, we not only get a similar number of eggs that you would have gotten with higher dose and higher cost, but we might also get even better quality eggs. And let's be honest, the cost difference is significant. And ultimately, when people have low ovarian reserve, I think this is the take home message. You cannot get 15 eggs out of ovaries that have a low AMH or a low follicle count that are only capable of producing 2 or 3 eggs. The key piece of information here is that we would be using a low dose IVF when we know the patient has ovarian reserve and we're trying to get the most number of eggs the ovary is capable of making, which is not a high number, with the lower dose to improve the quality of the eggs and also to reduce the cost for the patients.
Mhm. Now, this is a good time to sort of clear up some of this terminology because it can get really confusing. When we're talking about this lower dose type of IVF, it can have many different names out there. So sometimes people will call it mini IVF. Sometimes people will refer to it as mini stim IVF, low dose IVF, min stim IVF. They're all really referring to the same concept. Again, using a lower dose of medications with the hope that we're going to get roughly about the same number of eggs and potentially better quality.
Now, just because that's not confusing enough, let's make it even more confusing. So, there is something called modified natural IVF, which is slightly different. Let me explain the difference. In a low dose IVF, we start the medications on day 2 of a cycle, and sometimes we add oral medications like letrozole or Clomid. Now, in the modified natural IVF, we wait for the body to select a follicle before adding any medication. So again, in a low dose, we start the medications right at day 2 of the cycle, hoping that that medication will drive the development of multiple follicles, as many as we can get. And in modifying natural IVF, we're just waiting for the body to select the one follicle, and we're supporting that with additional medications.
It's worth noting who might be more appropriate for each of these protocols as well. When we are talking about patients with low egg reserve or decreased ovarian reserve or DOR, that can encompass a wide range of egg reserves. There is the Bologna criteria, for instance, that specifies or has, quote unquote, rules about what low egg reserve means. But really, we're thinking about mini IVF for patients who may get, two, three, four, five eggs. When we are thinking about this modified natural IVF, that's really for patients who have a very low egg reserve, where they are probably getting one egg regardless of the dose of stimulation. That's where a modified natural approach may make the most sense.
Yeah, now let's talk about some of the research associated with this. So, there is some really encouraging data about low dose IVF with patients with low ovarian reserve. For example, study in the International Journal of Reproductive Medicine found that clinical pregnancy rates were actually higher with minimal stimulation protocols compared to high dose stimulation protocols.
That's so interesting. And what I find even more interesting about this topic is that the ASRM, which is, of course, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, they did a big review on this topic specifically, looking at these low dose IVF protocols back in 2018. From that, they found that pregnancy rates for people who are poor responders or who have decreased ovarian reserve, another way to say that if you're using mild stimulation protocols, they actually have the same pregnancy rates as when you're using a conventional dose stimulation, which I find very compelling.
I think the big takeaway for our listeners is that if you have low ovarian reserve and previous cycles with high doses of gonadotropin that only gave you a few eggs and no pregnancy, low dose IVF might be worth discussing with your doctor. It doesn't mean that everybody with low ovarian reserve has to have this protocol at the very beginning of the journey, but certainly you and I have both seen lots of patients that have come sometimes for second and third opinions where this is never tried. And sometimes it's just worth trying these protocols before moving on to the next level of care in decreased ovarian reserve, which should be using an egg donor when there's really no other method of stimulating the ovaries.
Exactly. And I think that there's a really strong financial argument for this, to be honest, because, let's say you're somebody who has low egg reserve and maybe you're getting two, three eggs per retrieval. Maybe it makes more sense to think about budgeting for multiple cycles
Right.
using a mini IVF with lower doses of medication, therefore lower costs, than using crazy high doses of medications to still get two, three eggs and basically blowing through the budget faster, right? As much as talking about budget is maybe secondary to the outcome of pregnancy, it's still really, really important. And it's so key to all of this. And we have to think about these things, right? We have to be practical.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another thing that I want to emphasize is that low dose IVF isn't only for people with low ovarian reserves. It can also be used for patients that have a very high ovarian reserve. So the complete opposite of what we're talking about, who are at risk of overstimulation. So somebody with an AMH level of 40 or 50, most doctors would choose a low dose gonadotropin to start because we know that even low dose would give a high number of eggs when you have a high ovarian reserve. And also for patients that have religious restrictions on the number of eggs that can be fertilized.
I actually can think of a case where I had a patient with very high egg reserve, but very poor egg quality, meaning, they made a ton of eggs, but we didn't make any embryos. And we did a low dose stimulation. And so the patient and her partner had to mentally buy in, mentally prepare for the fact that they were going to get less eggs, but they actually made way better quality embryos. So I also feel sometimes like this is a great protocol for patients who have maybe surprisingly poor, unexpectedly poor egg quality as a way to change things up too.
Yeah. And that brings me back to my own journey, actually, because my oldest was born when I was about 33 and I had infertility. I had multiple IVF cycles. I have really high ovarian reserve. I had a standard dose of gonadotropin, made a ton of eggs as expected of somebody with high ovarian reserve, I think 26. One of those eggs became an embryo that became my son, my oldest. But then years passed and I tried to do more cycles to have another one. And I still had high ovarian reserve, but the quality of my eggs really took a dive as years passed. And actually, my second child, who is now 7 years old, he's actually the product of a low dose IVF protocol. So I have a standard IVF baby and a low dose IVF baby. And it's exactly what you said. I had really good ovarian reserve, but the quality of my eggs was getting worse and worse with each cycle. So we decided to go back and yes, get less eggs, which I did get less eggs than I normally did. But one of them was the golden egg at 40 years of age.
And for the record, both babies were equally cute and made both equally cute boys right now. The dose of gonadotropin does not
Right.
affect the cuteness of the baby, for the record. Now, before we wrap up, I mean, there are so many questions that still remain unanswered in this field.
Yeah, we have a lot more research that needs to be done. Gosh, if I had a magic wand, but specifically when it comes to low dose IVF, we still need research comparing different low dose stimulation protocols. Whether you add letrozole, whether you add Clomid, which dose of gonadotropin, how much LH do you need to add to these protocols? We need more data on live births, not just pregnancy rates. And we also don't know if doing multiple low-dose cycles and banking embryos may be more effective than doing one traditional cycle.
Those are really, really excellent points. And I think that also leads us to this bigger umbrella of we don't necessarily know what the perfect protocol is for somebody with low egg reserve on so many levels, not just in terms of the protocol and the dose of medications. And so there's still lots of research to be done in that area. For our listeners who want to learn more about this approach, we always recommend having a detailed discussion with your fertility specialist to see if it might be right for you. Again, everybody's history is different, everybody's egg reserve is different, everybody's goals are different. And that's why it's always important to take this information, but then always think about your personal situation as well.
And of course, if you would like to hear more about IVF, check out episode 14, IVF Part 1. This is the episode where we talk about the procedure itself and everything you need to know about undergoing IVF. Also, episode 20, IVF Part 2, discuss the risks related to the egg producer, the procedure itself, and risk to pregnancy and baby from IVF. Check out episode 54, which is IVF Part 3. In this episode, we talk about IVF, add-ons, adjuvant therapies, and other things that we can do to improve egg quality and embryo quality. Now, to learn more about decreased ovarian reserve, check out episode 33. We talk about the impact of decreased ovarian reserve on fertility and IVF treatments. Have a great week, superhumans, and don't forget to be back here next Tuesday.
And that's a wrap for today, superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast or visit us online at markandfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss.
Music from Mixkit, Life is a Dream by Michael Ramir C.
My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.